Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to leave the sealed rooms of history. In the dead silence of midnight, the Whitlock name echoes like a curse through the crumbling halls of New England's oldest estates. Their story is not written in books for the public. It survives in fragmented letters, in erased ledgers, and in whispered confessions buried so deep that only those who seek forbidden truths dare to resurrect them. And yet, the truth demands to be spoken. The Whitlocks were not just another wealthy colonial family. They were architects of something far darker. Behind their portraits, behind the carefully cultivated image of respectability, they wove a legacy drenched in manipulation, death, and a hunger for control that has rippled through centuries. The world remembers them as merchants, landowners, and benefactors. But that was the mask. Strip it away, and you uncover something else. A dynasty that fed on fear, orchestrated suffering, and turned human lives into currency. It is said that every Whitlock child was raised not in the warmth of family, but in the shadow of ritual. They were taught not love, but control, not faith, but submission, to be born. Whitlock was to be initiated into a game of power that had no end, a cycle of dominance that drew strength from silence and blood. Most families die with time. Their names fade, their fortunes dissolve. But not the Whitlocks. Their grip was never financial alone. It was psychological, spiritual, institutional. They understood what most men never dare to grasp, that the true chains are invisible and the strongest prisons are built inside the mind. That is why their influence survived collapse after collapse, war after war. Because what they built was not just a fortune, it was a machine of control. This is not folk. The earliest whispers of the Whitlocks emerge in Salem's shadow, where the line between religion and tyranny was thin enough to vanish. They arrived in the colonies not as humble settlers, but as watchers, calculating, ambitious, already aware that the soil of this new world was ripe for more than crops. They understood something most men did not, that a land born in fear and Puritan fire would always hunger for chains, and they came prepared to feed it. The Whitlocks did not waste time chasing the petty quarrels of farmers or merchants. They embedded themselves where power bleeds deepest, inside the courts, inside the church, inside the places where a man's conscience could be broken. Their name appears subtly in trial records, attached not to accusations but to endorsements. When women were burned, when neighbors were dragged from their homes under the charge of witchcraft, it was often a Whitlock whisper that set the spark. They learned early that fear could make men destroy themselves, and so they became cultivators of fear. They never swung the axe, but they sharpened it. They never lit the fire, but they stacked the wood. You see, power is not in the action, it is in the orchestration. And the Whitlocks orchestrated with precision. They studied how hysteria spreads, how isolation poisons the mind, how institutions could sanctify cruelty by calling it justice. They wove themselves into the very fabric of that hysteria, not to end it, but to learn from it. Salem was not their tragedy. It was their experiment, and the results were undeniable. Families destroyed, inheritances seized, reputations obliterated. Every victim was another brick in the Whitlock foundation, another lesson in how to rule without ever showing your hand. And when the smoke cleared, while others bore the scars of loss, the Whitlocks walked away untouched, richer, stronger, their reach stretching deeper into the spine of a nation that had barely begun. Understand this. The Whitlocks were not interested in superstition. They did not care about witches or demons. What fascinated them was obedience. They saw the witch trials not as madness, but as a mirror of human weakness, a stage where fear itself was the true executioner. And once they saw how easily men could be enslaved by terror, they knew they had found the key to immortality. Because fortunes fade, armies fall, but control of the human spirit, that endures forever. As the embers of Salem dimmed, the Whitlocks shifted their gaze to a far more profitable battlefield. Wealth and blood. They understood that hysteria could burn bright but brief. Gold and land, however, carried the power to bind generations. Their estates multiplied like shadows in every corner of New England. But these were not simple inheritances, they were trophies of ruin. Each property, each acre of soil, was bought with bloodless signatures that concealed bloody origins. Families destroyed by whispers of witchcraft. Merchants crushed under sudden debts. Rivals who mysteriously vanished. These absences were the silent bricks of the Whitlock Empire. Yet property alone was not enough. The Whitlocks knew that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in obligations. They perfected the art of contracts, not the kind you could escape, but covenants that carried the weight of ritual. It was said they wrote agreements in ink laced with iron shavings, signed upon altars where prayers were twisted into curses. Men who bound themselves to Whitlock terms did not merely lose fortunes, they lost futures. Their heirs were shackled, their names tarnished, their bloodline absorbed into the ever-expanding web of Whitlock power. To borrow from a Whitlock was to mortgage your very soul. Letters uncovered from the late 1700s reveal coded phrases: securing the harvest, binding the line, weight of blood. Scholars dismiss them as business metaphors. But look deeper and the truth sharpens. These were not metaphors. They were acknowledgments of a deeper system, one that turned every handshake into a noose, every promise into a chain. And through these chains, the Whitlocks ensured obedience stretched not just across years, but across generations. It is here that their legacy mutates from greed into something malevolent. Wealth was never their end goal, it was only the bait. Control was the true prize. The estates, the contracts, the inheritances, all were instruments, carefully tuned to keep men bound, broken and loyal. Every stone in their manor walls, every ledger in their archives, every faded crest etched above their doors is not a symbol of achievement, but a monument to manipulation. And here lies the darkest truth. While revolutions raged, while nations rose and fell, the Whitlocks remained untouched. Empires may crumble, kings may fall, but the man who controls debt, inheritance, and obligation, he becomes untouchable. That was their secret, and it is why their legacy still pulses in the veins of modern institutions today, hidden in plain sight, shaping lives without ever being named. By the dawn of the American Republic, when the ink of independence was still drying, the Whitlocks had already embedded themselves like roots in the soil of every institution that mattered. While patriots fought for liberty, the Whitlocks fought for something colder, control of the very systems that would define that liberty. Courts, churches, banks, these were not public goods to them. They were instruments to be tuned, levers to be pulled, cages to be built. It began with the courts. A Whitlock never argued cases in the open. They positioned themselves behind the curtain as silent advisors, benefactors and confidants to judges whose robes were far from clean. Trials were less about justice than about reinforcement of hierarchy. A debtor facing ruin, a widow disputing inheritance, a rival family seeking restitution. These cases rarely ended in fairness. More often than not, they ended in the slow tightening of Whitlock influence as verdicts tilted in their favor like dice weighted with blood. And because the outcomes were cloaked in law, no one questioned them. Obedience disguised as justice is the most effective form of slavery. Then came the church. In the fragile moral compass of the new nation, ministers held extraordinary power over hearts and minds. The Whitlocks did not resist this. They fed it. They donated to churches, funded new pews, sponsored hymnals, but their generosity was never pure. Every coin they gave was a string pulled tighter. Sermons subtly shifted from salvation to obedience, from faith to fear. Congregations were taught not how to think, but how to kneel. And behind the pulpit's thunderous warnings of sin, a Whitlock hand always lingered, guiding the message. But perhaps the most insidious conquest was the secret orders. In smoky lodges lit by candlelight, where symbols dripped with ancient echoes, the Whitlocks found their perfect theater. These were not men of superstition, they were men of calculation. They studied rituals not to worship but to weaponize. They understood how symbols could bypass logic, how ceremonies could mold identity, how secrecy itself could breed loyalty deeper than law. And they did not merely join these orders, they reshaped them. Oaths once meant for fraternity became tools of surveillance. Rituals meant for unity became drills in submission. This was the Whitlock genius. They never ruled by force when they could rule by consent. and they never demanded obedience when they could manufacture it. By the time America called itself free, its institutions were already tethered to invisible chains, and the Whitlocks held the keys. What began in Salem hysteria had now matured into something vast, something permanent. The Whitlocks had become the architects of invisible prisons, and most men even today never realize they live inside one. War has always been the perfect stage for those who know how to play both sides, and the Whitlocks understood this better than anyone. While common men marched into the smoke of battle believing in ideals, the Whitlocks dealt in certainties. That blood spilled on fields is less valuable than debt signed in candlelit rooms. Every war, every rebellion, every uprising was not a tragedy for them, it was a transaction. And every corpse was another ledger entry in their book of control. During the Revolution, they never declared loyalty to one flag. They wore patriot colors in the day, then toasted with loyalists at night. While neighbors accused each other of treason, Whitlock ships carried supplies to both armies. They profited from every musket fired, every ration delivered, every scrap of intelligence whispered in a tavern. And when the dust settled, they were richer than before, untouched by the cost of war because they had engineered the game itself. Soldiers fought for freedom, but the Whitlocks fought for permanence. And permanence they achieved, but their genius did not lie only in trade. They also learned how to harvest chaos. They watched how men broken by war came home hollow, desperate, malleable. Veterans crippled in body and spirit became easy prey. Many found themselves indebted to Whitlock estates, their land bought for pennies, their futures mortgaged for scraps. The Whitlocks thrived on despair because despair makes men obedient. And when an entire generation limped home, the Whitlocks extended their hands, not in mercy, but in silent ownership. It was the same pattern repeated through conflict after conflict. The War of 1812, the Civil War, even whispers of their presence in arms trades abroad, all painted the same truth. They didn't see war as destruction, they saw it as harvest. Men bleed, nations fractured, but through it all, the Whitlocks grew stronger. Their name carried not on banners but in contracts, debts, inheritances, and graves. And here is the most chilling reality. The Whitlocks proved that war is not about victory or loss. It is about transformation. After every conflict, society emerges different, more centralized, more obedient, more desperate for order. And in that desperation, men surrender freedoms they would never otherwise give. The Whitlocks did not merely survive war. They used it as a forge, shaping nations into cages and men into servants. Their blood-stained fingerprints are on the very architecture of modern power. And once you recognize their pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. As cannons fell silent and treaties were signed, the Whitlocks turned their gaze to something far more dangerous than the battlefield, the human mind. They had already mastered fear in courts, submission in churches, and obedience in war. But now they began to ask a darker question. How could a man be enslaved without ever realizing he wore chains? The answer lay not in violence but in psychology, centuries before the word was even common on human tongues. They began with observation. Diaries from Whitlock estates show meticulous notes on servants, tenants, even their own children. Every fear, every weakness, every desire was catalogued like specimens under glass. They studied the effects of isolation, starvation, humiliation. They recorded how long it took for a man to break when denied sleep, how quickly a woman surrendered her secrets when her child was threatened. To them, people were not souls, they were mechanisms. And like mechanisms, they could be dismantled and rebuilt. But their experiments did not remain confined to their estates. No, the Whitlocks understood that for control to be absolute, it must operate in the open while remaining unseen. Schools became laboratories. Students were molded through discipline masked as morality, obedience masquerading as education. Children raised in such systems grew into adults who believed compliance was virtue and submission was freedom. What began as cruel games in Whitlock halls had now become a template for society itself. Even religion, already twisted by their hand, was weaponized further. Ministers, bought or indebted, were encouraged to emphasize guilt, shame, and unworthiness. Congregations were taught that they were broken. incapable of salvation without constant obedience to authority. Every sermon was a psychological script designed to erode confidence and cement dependency. The Whitlocks were no longer just landowners or merchants. They were engineers of perception, and perception, once controlled, makes chains invisible. When a man believes obedience is his own choice, he becomes the perfect servant. No whips, no shackles, no prisons needed, only suggestion, ritual, repetition. The Whitlocks perfected what would later be called social conditioning centuries before the term was ever spoken. They proved that the deepest prison is not built of stone, but of belief. And here is the dark inheritance. What they pioneered did not end with them. The methods survive in schools that teach conformity instead of strength, in pulpits that demand guilt instead of freedom, in systems that tell you who you are before you even dare to ask. The Whitlocks discovered the machinery of the mind, and once the gears began to turn, the world itself became their laboratory. By the early 19th century, the Whitlocks had perfected their private experiments. But to expand their reach, they needed allies hidden inside the new sciences of the age. This was the moment they turned their attention to medicine, asylum wards, and the shadowed corridors of emerging institutions. And what followed would lay the foundation for modern social engineering. The first clue lies in the ledgers of a Whitlock estate near Boston. Payments were quietly funneled to physicians known for their curious practices. These men were not healers, they were experimenters. They dissected the mind with the coldness of butchers, searching for ways to silence hysteria, cure disobedience, erase identity. Patients who entered their asylums rarely left whole, if they left at all. But the Whitlocks funded them, supplied them, and shielded them from scrutiny. Why? Because they were learning. Every shattered patient was a lesson in how the mind could be broken, how memory could be erased, how obedience could be carved into flesh. Records of Whitlock correspondence with asylum directors revealed chilling language. Subject responded well to isolation. Test yielded compliance after prolonged exposure. These were not treatments, they were trials. The asylum was no place of healing. It was a crucible where the weak were melted down and reforged into silence. And in these crucibles, Whitlock influence thrived, because what better way to refine psychological control than to test it on society's discarded? But the Whitlocks did not stop at medicine. They began weaving themselves into institutions that claimed to guard knowledge. Universities, libraries, seminaries, all became fertile ground. Professors indebted to Whitlock funds preached obedience cloaked in philosophy. Histories were rewritten, not to reveal truth, but to erase it. Students left, not with sharpened minds, but with softened wills, molded into perfect citizens, obedient, unquestioning, docile. And always, secrecy remained their shield. To the public, they were patrons of science, benefactors of education, pious donors of churches. Behind closed doors, they were architects of manipulation, refining the craft of controlling men without chains. The asylum, the classroom, the pulpit, they were not separate worlds. They were laboratories connected by invisible threads, all humming to the same sinister frequency. It is here the Whitlocks transitioned from a family to a network. Their blood still ruled, but their reach no longer required their name. Their methods could live in others, in institutions, in traditions. And when control becomes faceless, it becomes eternal. The Whitlocks had learned the greatest truth of all. You do not need to rule men directly. You only need to shape the cages they mistake for freedom. Control of the mind was only half the equation. The Whitlocks knew that to bind men completely, you must also command their survival, their bread, their livelihood, their wealth. And so, in the dawning age of industrial finance, the Whitlocks slipped quietly into the bloodstream of banking, not with the loud bravado of tycoons, but with the subtle patience of parasites. Their genius was never to stand in the spotlight, it was to pull the strings from the shadows while others danced. At first they moved through credit. Farmers and tradesmen desperate for capital signed contracts inked by Whitlock attorneys. These loans were traps, structured to appear generous but designed for default. When the inevitable collapse came, land, tools, and futures were absorbed into Whitlock estates. A man might believe he had simply failed, but in truth, his downfall had been engineered from the first stroke of his pen. Debt became a noose and the Whitlocks held the rope. Then came the banks. Records trace Whitlock money into the founding of early financial institutions, silent partnerships, hidden shares, faceless trusts. While merchants celebrated prosperity, they never noticed the invisible hand siphoning power upward. Every boom, every bust, every cycle of panic fattened the Whitlocks, for they did not gamble, they rigged the game. They learned that fear of hunger, fear of ruin, fear of losing one's place in society were more binding than chains. And with each collapse, more men bowed willingly to the system, never suspecting that the system itself was a Whitlock creation. But the darkest stroke was their manipulation of identity itself. In the early 1800s, documents became as valuable as land. Birth records, deeds, wills, these were proof of existence. And through their ties to courts and clerks, the Whitlocks learned to edit existence itself. Entire families erased from registries, rival heirs blotted from history, unwanted witnesses buried beneath clerical errors. The public never questioned it. To lose one's papers was to lose oneself. And so, the Whitlocks discovered the ultimate weapon, not killing a man, but erasing him. This was their evolution, from merchants of fear to engineers of destiny. They understood that money was not gold or paper, it was trust, belief, submission. And when you control what men believe gives them survival, you control their very existence. The Whitlocks did not just build wealth, they built dependence. And dependence, once planted, grows into a chain so heavy that even generations cannot break free. This was no longer a family's ambition, it was becoming a system. A system that did not need a Whitlock face to enforce it. A system that would outlive them all. The Whitlocks understood that empires built on money and contracts could collapse, but empires built in blood endure. And so, in the 19th century, they turned their attention inward, into their own lineage, into the weaving of marriages, and into something far darker, the shaping of bloodlines. To the world, they appeared as a family of elegance and refinement. Their union celebrated in the pages of society columns. But behind those staged photographs and public ceremonies lay a strategy as cold as stone. Every Whitlock marriage was a transaction, every child a calculated investment. They rarely married for love. Instead, they targeted bloodlines that carried power, judges' daughters, merchants' heirs, ministers' sisters. Each union was a merger, a quiet acquisition of influence disguised as matrimony. And when rivals resisted, whispers of scandal or sudden financial ruin often forced them into compliance. To marry into the Whitlocks was not a blessing. It was assimilation. Families that entered their orbit often dissolved within a generation, absorbed into the Whitlock shadow. Their names forgotten while the Whitlock legacy grew stronger. But marriage was only the surface. Letters hidden in private collections hint at an obsession deeper than politics, an obsession with purity, with control of heredity itself. They spoke of refining the stock, of strengthening the line. Some scholars dismiss this as the arrogance of aristocrats. But others, more cautious, have noted the pattern. How Whitlock unions often rejected alliances with outsiders, how cousins married cousins, how children were raised not as individuals, but as vessels of the family will. It was not simply about keeping wealth intact. It was about preserving a legacy in flesh, and where bloodlines did not serve, they experimented. Servants' children disappeared, only to reappear in Whitlock households under strange circumstances. Rumors spread of infants exchanged at birth, of children raised under false parentage, of orphans adopted not out of charity but out of curiosity. These stories, dismissed as gossip, carried one chilling consistency. The Whitlocks were always seeking to mold humanity itself, as if men and women were raw material to be shaped at will. Here lies the sinister genius of their design. Wealth controlled land, contracts controlled labor, but blood controlled destiny. And the Whitlocks wanted to ensure that destiny itself bent to their. Blood was not enough for the Whitlocks. It had to be consecrated. And so they wrapped their lineage in ritual, binding flesh to power with symbols older than the colonies themselves. In candlelit chambers hidden within their sprawling estates, marriages were not celebrated. They were sanctified, turned into ceremonies that blended scripture, oath, and something far darker. Each union was less about love or union than about sacrifice, as if the couple themselves were offerings to the family's eternal design. Guests whispered of weddings where the air was thick with incense, where brides wore veils dyed not in white but in crimson. Rings were etched with sigils that no jeweler claimed to have crafted, patterns that echoed through generations. And when the vows were spoken, they were never the simple words of husband and wife. Instead, they invoked phrases about legacy, obedience, and the binding of lineages unto the end of days. To the outside world, it was eccentric tradition. To the Whitlocks, it was law. Their children were baptized not in public chapels, but in private rites, with ministers who were often little more than Whitlock servants in clerical robes. It is said that in these ceremonies, drops of the infant's blood were taken, mixed with wine, and consumed by those present. Such rumors were dismissed as grotesque invention, but the consistency of accounts makes them difficult to ignore. These were not simply rituals of faith. They were contracts written in flesh and sealed in secrecy. Symbols played a central role. Whitlock estates were adorned with carvings and stained glass patterns that seemed decorative, but held deeper meaning. Spirals, crossed keys, and serpents devouring their own tails. These were not the symbols of one faith, but fragments stolen from many, woven into a tapestry that whispered of something ancient, something deliberately hidden. To walk through their halls was to be surrounded by a language most men could not read, but all could feel pressing against their souls. And here lies the true power of the Whitlocks. They fused blood with ritual, family with cult. Every birth, every marriage, every death was not a personal milestone, but a reinforcement of the system. To be Whitlock was not to live freely. It was to serve the legacy, to be consumed by it, to become another stone in a wall that stretched across centuries. And through these rituals, they ensured that no Whitlock child ever truly belonged to themselves. They belonged to the machine. The family did not serve God, nor king, nor nation. The family served only itself. If you walk the ruins of the Whitlock estates today, you might think you are looking at mansions. But you would be wrong. They were not homes, they were machines. Machines of stone and timber, designed not to comfort, but to condition. Every corridor, every chamber, every hidden passage was built with intention. The Whitlocks did not construct houses. They constructed prisons of the soul. Their architecture carried a geometry that unsettled the eye. Staircases that led nowhere. Windows that opened into walls. Rooms with ceilings too low designed to press upon the mind. Guests spoke of disorientation, of time slipping strangely within Whitlock halls, as though the walls themselves conspired against them. It was not poor craftsmanship, it was deliberate. A constant reminder that space, like thought, could be manipulated. You did not move freely in a Whitlock home. You moved where they wanted you to move. Beneath the estates lay darker secrets. Catacombs, vaults, tunnels that wound beneath the earth. Some ended in chambers lined with symbols carved into the stone, others in pits where whispers of ritual echoed. Neighbors claimed to hear chanting beneath the soil on certain nights, a low thrum that vibrated through the ground like a second heartbeat. Most dismissed it as superstition, but the servants knew. They spoke in hushed tones of rites performed underground, where family oaths were renewed in secrecy, away from the eyes of God and man alike. Even the visible spaces carried meaning. Stained glass windows depicted not saints, but abstract symbols, coils, spirals, eyes unblinking. Dining halls bore murals of harvest, not of crops, but of faceless figures bowing in rows. To dine there was to eat beneath images of submission, to drink beneath the gaze of eternity. It was architecture not as shelter, but as sermon. And here lies the chilling truth. The Whitlocks were centuries ahead of their time in understanding how environment molds thought. They knew that walls could shape obedience, that architecture could be a silent teacher, that a house could whisper rules louder than any man. To grow up in a Whitlock estate was not to live in luxury. It was to be trained, conditioned, broken and rebuilt by stone itself. The Whitlock homes did not merely contain their family. They contained their philosophy, and that philosophy was simple, ruthless, eternal. A man who cannot trust his own senses is a man already enslaved. Within those walls, freedom was not destroyed. It was unthinkable. The Whitlock estates were not only prisons for the soul, they were theaters for power. Beneath their vaulted ceilings and underground chambers, men of influence gathered in secret, drawn by the gravity of the Whitlock name. Politicians, judges, merchants, ministers, each found themselves summoned into those dimly lit halls where the rules of society dissolved. And only one law remained, the law of control. What unfolded there was not a dinner, not a meeting, but a ritual of dominance disguised as civility. Invitations were never written. A messenger would arrive at a man's door with nothing but a sealed coin, bearing the Whitlock crest. To refuse was unthinkable. To accept was a quiet surrender. Once inside, attendees found themselves seated at long oak tables, meals served beneath murals of faceless multitudes bowing in chains. Wine flowed, but it was not a celebration. It was a test. Every word spoken was weighed, every silence measured. The Whitlocks knew how to press on a man's ambition, how to exploit his fear, how to make him confess desires he dared not speak aloud. And once spoken, those desires became chains. Blackmail was not their weapon. The councils that emerged from those Whitlock gatherings were not idle conspiracies whispered over candlelight. They were blueprints for domination. Each man who had crossed the threshold of those estates returned to his station carrying invisible chains. A judge returned to his courtroom, yet his gavel no longer belonged to him. A minister returned to his pulpit, yet the words he spoke were no longer his own. A merchant returned to his counting house, but the numbers he recorded served a master he dared not name. In this way, the Whitlocks did not seize power. They rewrote it at the source. Decisions that appeared to arise from law, commerce, or doctrine were orchestrated before the public ever heard of them. Laws punishing dissenters were not born from necessity but from Whitlock decrees. Trade routes, banking regulations, even taxes, all tilted subtly toward their advantage, yet cloaked in language that suggested inevitability. What seemed like the natural order of society was in truth a script written in their halls. The people lived inside an illusion, blind to the strings being pulled above them. But it was not enough for the Whitlocks to control structures. They sought to mold identity itself. Schools were encouraged to teach obedience, not inquiry. Sermons thundered with warnings against rebellion while whispering praise for sacrifice to unseen powers. Families learned to police themselves for fear that deviation would invite ruin. Men began to measure their worth not by strength, not by honor, but by proximity to the very forces tightening their chains. The Whitlocks had discovered the most effective prison of all, one built in the mind. Generations passed, yet the echoes remained. Leaders rose and fell, institutions grew and crumbled, yet each bore the fingerprints of those gatherings. The Whitlocks understood that true power is not in what a man does, but in what he believes he must never question. And so they wove doubt into conviction, fear into loyalty, and silence into virtue. By the time their influence was recognized, it was already irreversible. This was their grand design, to shape not just laws, not just wealth, but the inner architecture of civilization. Man may escape a dungeon, a people may rise against a tyrant. But how does one rebel against beliefs planted in childhood, laws presented as sacred, truths whispered into prayer? That is where the Whitlocks lived, in the shadows of perception, architects of a reality no one dared to challenge. Beyond their own borders, the Whitlocks reached further than any map revealed. To them, wars were not calamities, they were opportunities. A battlefield was simply another table, a nation merely another pawn. Armies marched under banners of patriotism, yet their blood was spilled according to Whitlock design. Conflict created debt, debt created dependency, and dependency delivered nations into invisible bondage. What kings believed were their victories were in truth carefully measured sacrifices to a higher order, one that bowed not to crowns, but to shadows. Plagues, too, became tools. While common folk perished in agony, the Whitlocks moved like surgeons of destiny. They monopolized medicines, hoarded grain, and sold salvation at a price that ensured entire regions would never rise again without their blessing. Outbreaks were not only tragedies, they were filters, sifting the strong from the weak, the obedient from the defiant. In this, they discovered another truth. Fear of death is a stronger chain than death itself. A man who knows he will die may resist. A man who believes he might live if only he complies will surrender everything. Revolutions. They orchestrated those as well. When a people grew restless under one ruler, the Whitlocks whispered rebellion into the right ears. They supplied arms, coin, promises of freedom. Yet once the flames had consumed the old order, they stepped forward with a new script, already written. The faces of leaders changed, but the chains of obedience remained. Those who believed they had won liberty awoke in a cage forged from their own celebration. The Whitlocks mastered the alchemy of turning hope into obedience. Through these methods, their influence spread not as an empire of land, but as an empire of dependency. They needed no armies to enforce their will. Nations bent under debts, kings caved under whispers, and common men bowed under hunger. Power, once concentrated in their halls, had radiated outward like a poison cloud, invisible yet inescapable. And still the people prayed to their kings, cheered their generals, trusted their priests, never knowing the script had already been signed in Whitlock ink. This was their final perfection, to become so hidden in history that they appeared absent. Even as every event bore their mark, wars, plagues, revolutions, they were never accidents, never inevitabilities. They were orchestrations, and every scream, every grave, every flag raised in triumph was another verse in the Whitlock legacy, a history written not in ink, but in blood. Every system of power leaves casualties, but the Whitlocks turned casualties into a language. Those who dared resist, who attempted to pull the veil from their neighbors' eyes, were not simply silenced. They were broken in ways that echoed through generations. A merchant who refused to yield found his ships mysteriously sunk, his family reduced to beggars in the streets, his name spoken as a curse. A minister who questioned the altered scriptures collapsed mid-sermon, his congregation told it was divine judgment. A judge who refused a verdict disappeared, his chambers sealed, his memory erased from records as though he had never lived. Resistance was not punished. It was rewritten into myth, into warning, into a ghost story whispered to keep others in line. But the greatest cruelty was psychological. The Whitlocks understood that a shattered mind is more useful than a dead body. They seeded paranoia into households. Children grew up watching fathers stripped of authority, mothers begging in silence. Siblings turned against each other for survival. Trust itself became a forbidden luxury. Men learned to guard their words, to doubt their neighbors, to suspect even their kin. In this atmosphere, loyalty to truth was severed, leaving only the instinct for survival. And in that survival, the Whitlocks reigned supreme. Perhaps most devastating of all were the betrayals they engineered. A man who thought himself strong would discover that his closest friend had been turned against him. A wife would learn that her husband's debts were signed in blood on Whitlock parchment. A soldier returning from war would find his homeland altered, his allegiance mocked, his sacrifices meaningless. The Whitlocks fed on these betrayals not for necessity but for design. They understood that a broken man spreads despair like a plague, infecting others with hopelessness until resistance dies unborn. And yet, hidden in these tragedies is the deepest revelation. The Whitlocks knew that fear does not end with death. It multiplies when a man watches others destroyed and wonders if he is next. They built their empire not on armies, not on gold, but on the quiet terror that seeps into a man's bones when he realizes he is powerless. This was their artistry, turning individuals into warnings, families into ruins, and resistance into legend. In the shadows of their legacy lies a truth that few dare whisper. The Whitlocks did not need to kill everyone who opposed them. They only needed to make every survivor believe that opposition was impossible. The centuries did not bury the Whitlocks. They adapted. As monarchies crumbled and republics rose, they slipped between the cracks, ensuring that every new system bore their fingerprints. When the Age of Kings ended, they did not mourn. They celebrated. for they understood that the illusion of freedom is a stronger chain than tyranny. A man who believes he is free will police himself far more brutally than any jailer could. And so the Whitlocks embraced the republics, the democracies, the constitutions. They whispered into the pens of lawmakers, ensuring that the words etched on parchment served their design, no matter how noble they appeared to the public. The industrial age gave them even greater reach. Factories multiplied not only goods but dependencies. Workers became numbers in ledgers, their lives measured in hours and wages. The Whitlocks knew this was fertile ground. They financed industries, cornered markets, and in every case ensured that labor served not prosperity, but control. The machines were loud, the smokestacks rose high, but beneath it all, the Whitlocks remained silent, invisible, guiding the gears with unseen hands. Even revolutions that promised equality carried their mark. Workers' movements, uprisings, labor strikes, each was subtly infiltrated, redirected, and repurposed. Outrage was allowed, even encouraged, so long as it served to reset the system in ways that preserved the Whitlock grip. Blood spilled in the streets, but the script remained intact. What appeared to be progress was, in truth, a controlled burn, preventing the wildfire of true liberation. By the time the modern world emerged, the Whitlocks no longer needed estates or councils lit by candlelight. Their influence was embedded in institutions, banks, courts, schools, parliaments. They had become the silent architecture of civilization itself. Leaders came and went, wars ignited and died, but the deeper structures endured because they were no longer visible as power. They were mistaken for reality itself, and that is their most terrifying accomplishment. For when power is visible, it can be resisted. But when power is mistaken for the natural order, when control is woven into the very fabric of belief, how does one fight it? The Whitlocks had achieved what few ever dream of. Immortality, not through bloodlines, but through ideas, systems, and illusions that survive even when names are forgotten. They had become the ghost in the foundation, the hand that writes history while erasing itself from the page. Look around you now, and you will see the Whitlocks everywhere, though their name has been erased. Their presence lingers like a shadow behind the curtain. The debt you carry, the laws you obey, the fears that haunt your nights, all are shaped by systems that trace their lineage back to those candlelit halls. You believe your struggles are personal, unique, accidental, but what if they were scripted centuries before you were born? What if the path you walk was paved by men who understood how to trap you without chains, how to tame you without a whip? The Whitlocks discovered that the strongest prison is identity itself. Today, men measure their worth by standards not their own, chasing money defined by someone else's rules, pursuing status crafted by someone else's design, worshipping truths handed down by voices they never chose to trust. This is the inheritance of the Whitlocks, not just controlling governments, but controlling you. The way you think, the way you doubt, the way you obey without realizing it. But here is the fracture in their design: awareness. Once you see the architecture of control, you can no longer unknow it. You are no longer a pawn sleepwalking across a board you didn't choose. You become something dangerous, something they never wanted you to be. A man who sees the strings. And once a man sees the strings, he can cut them. If you followed me this far, you are already shifting. You are already slipping out of the role they wrote for you. But to seal this transformation, I want you to declare it, not to me, but to yourself, and to the algorithm that has been trying to bury voices like this one. Write these words twice in the comments exactly as I give them to you. I see the strings. I cut the strings. Do this, and you will mark yourself as someone who refuses to live blind. Do this, and you will not only reinforce your own awakening, you will amplify this message, spreading it to others who need to hear it. The Whitlocks thrived in silence, in secrecy, in the absence of witnesses. But when men begin to speak, when they begin to see, the foundation trembles. This is your moment to step out of the role they scripted and into the one they feared. A man who cannot be deceived. Remember, the chains are not real once you choose to see them. And that is the beginning of everything. This is where the descent ends and the reckoning begins. You've walked through the halls of the Whitlocks, seen the blood beneath their marble floors, felt the weight of centuries pressing on your chest. You know now that their legacy was never about one family. It was a template, a prototype of power so refined that it no longer needs a name. The faces may have changed, the estates crumbled to ruins, but the architecture of control endures. It lives in contracts you never signed, in creeds you never swore, in loyalties you never chose. Understand this: once you have seen it, you can never return to the comfort of ignorance. You can never again pretend that the forces shaping your life are random, that the chains around your mind are invisible, because they aren't there. You've stepped into dangerous knowledge, the kind that transforms a man forever. And that transformation is what the Whitlocks always feared. A man awake, a man watching, a man who no longer accepts the script. But awakening is only the beginning. You must hold it. Every day you will feel the pull of old beliefs trying to drag you back into sleep. Every day the world will whisper that you imagined it all. That is their final defense, convincing you that the truth you glimpsed was just a story. Resist it. Anchor yourself in the reality you've seen. Speak it, live it. Shape yourself into the man who cannot be moved. The Whitlocks may be ghosts now, but their blueprint still stalks the living. Yet blueprints can be torn, scripts can be rewritten. The chains you've inherited can be melted down and forged into weapons of your own choosing. That is what they never wanted you to know. The same power they use to control can be used to create. Awareness is contagion. One man seeing becomes two, two become 1,000, and the quiet terror that once kept men silent begins to tremble under the weight of their voices. So leave this video not as a spectator, but as a conspirator of freedom. The Whitlocks built their empire on silence. Break it. They built their empire on obedience. Defy it. They built their empire on your blindness. See everything. This is the forbidden knowledge you were never meant to hear. And now that you've heard it, you are no longer theirs.